Hi, Megan.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
Well, I just got back from Asia, where I got a chance to read your new book, which I'm now going to flash for the camera, if this works. This is, Nobodies, Modern American Slave Labor and the Dark Side of the New Global Economy, which you're here to talk about with us today.
Mm-hmm.
So
we tried to make that title as catchy as possible.
Well, I mean, once you got the word slavery in the title, I think at least you get the crazed leftists and also people who have mistaken the social science section for the pornography section. So you win either way.
Although we could have showed more TNA on the cover, I think, to really move that puppy off the shelf.
Yeah, I think the tomatoes are probably not selling it quite as much, but maybe people will think you're just being subtle. So tell me about the book.
Tell you about the book.
Can you just sum it up for... I mean, I've read it, actually, but can you sum it up for the audience a little bit?
Sure. I should be able to do that by now. Well, it's about 3 different slavery cases that take place on American soil. One in Florida, one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and one in the U.S. Commonwealth of Saipan, which is actually a chain of islands to the south of Japan. And, it's much more than just about slavery, but it's sort of studying the attitudes and the facts of each case and kind of making this larger meditation about globalization and how free people respond to less free people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the...
And basic...
So I guess the first question that certainly like a lot of conservatives, libertarians would ask is this really slavery as we understand it?
Well, usually the word slavery is defined as someone not being free to leave. And so whether it's for 5 minutes or whether it's for 5 years or 5 generations, that's kind of the bright line that you have to use. If somebody is being held against their will and force and coercion are being used to keep them there. So in each of these cases, there are, a judge's gavel has come down and ruled, yes, these people were unfree to leave. And when you're talking about people who are raping or killing or threatening to rape or kill, works for me.
So the first case that you talk about, there's physical intimidation. The case in Florida, there's actually people being threatened with death if they leave. Although the time in which they're expected to stay there is pretty short duration, right? This is, in my understanding is it's basically like they want them there for a couple of weeks, and then they expect the workers to move on. So they don't expect them to stay there for the rest of their lives working in this plantation. Is that right?
Not for the rest of their lives, but in this case they were there for a month. Mm-hmm. They wanted them to stay for the whole orange picking season, which I think is 9 months. I think in general, if you have somebody under your thumb, you want to keep them there as long as possible.
Right.
And also these labor contractors move around. They'll pick oranges in Florida and then they'll move up to North Carolina to pick tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever. So if you have workers under your control and they're actually going to stay there, they probably want to keep that going as long as possible.
So, theoretically, to nail down the definition of slavery a little bit better, is being in the armed forces slavery?
No. Unless someone's forcing you to do it.
Theoretically, I undertake a contract with the government, but once I've enlisted, I'm not free to leave. They will come and they will, implicitly threaten to kill me. Certainly they will threaten to kill me if I try to leave in the middle of a battle. So I guess the question I'm trying to get at is, can you make a good contract to where someone has the right to then keep you from leaving? If you enter into that contract voluntarily, is it slavery or is it, is indentured servitude the same thing as slavery? Is it illegitimate? Does it become legitimate?
No, you have to imagine a sliding scale between total freedom and total slavery, and there are millions of gradations, millions of conditions within that. Throughout history there have been slaves who had a ton of power and had lives that were, in many ways, better than lives of the plebeians around them who were supposedly free. But what it all comes down to is someone else has control over your person.
Right.
Okay, so if it's you joining the Army or a football player signing a 7-year contract, I mean, in either case, you're not free to do everything and anything you want to.
Well, but like physically in the Army,
slavery,
in fact,
but
in the case of the Army, like they have physical control over you. You're not free to move around. You're not free to exit the contract, right? You can't decide early that you want to quit. You have to serve out your enlistment, and if you don't serve out your enlistment, they will send guys with guns after you to bring you back.
Will they send out guys with guns after you?
Sure, MPs carry guns last time I looked.
Huh?
Sure, last time I looked, the military police carried guns.
Okay, but if you desert the U.S. Army and you go hide in Canada or Kansas or whatever, force is not the ultimate thing that they're going to bear upon you. It's going to be the legal process. What I'm talking about is when
but the legal process does ultimately, right, involve people with guns coming after you and threatening to shoot you unless you stay in place, right? Like they'll put you in prison and then they will shoot you if you try to leave. I
don't think they'll shoot you. That's sort of an exaggeration.
Well, I mean, they do try to shoot people who try to break out of prison, right? And they do shoot people.
They? I mean, I don't know. Whatever. This is getting a little bit arcane.
But like going back to so in the case of the first contractor, you have this threat of physical force. In the case of the second contractor, it's less clear, right? I mean, the biggest threat seems to be deportation.
Well, it's an array of things that this guy did. Let me explain the case a little bit.
Sure.
First of all, it's a guy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who owns a welding firm, and he's paying American workers $15-20 an hour, and he starts getting into this business of bringing over workers from India to train at his firm for a while, and then he's shipping them off to a joint venture that he started in Kuwait. So he has one group come over, they stay for a few weeks, he sends them to Kuwait. He has another group come over, sends them to Kuwait. He has a third group come over, and by this time he's realized, wow, I kind of like having these guys who work really hard for $3 an hour. Why should I pay my Americans $15 to $20 an hour? Mm-hmm. So what he does is, first of all, they're paying $2,200 in India to get the job, which is a fortune, and they're paying exorbitant rates of interest. So I don't know how to calculate this, but it would be sort of like us owing $200,000 or $300,000. It's a sum that we could maybe pay back at some point, although I don't know how much you make as a freelance journalist. It would take a long time for me to pay it back. So that's one very big threat held over their head. A second thing is when they arrive in Tulsa at the airport, this boss takes away their passport. Number 3, they are told, if you leave the factory premises where we are going to be housing you, there are Negroes in this neighborhood around here who smoke crack, and they're crazy, and they'll rob and kill you. And if you get past them, there are white people who hate people who look like you because they think you're Islamic terrorists, and they will kill you too. So it's better if you don't leave. And then they start wanting to leave or sneaking up, and the guys start threatening them with deportation. If they get deported while they haven't paid back their $2,200 loan, they can kiss their houses goodbye. They can kiss the well-being of their family goodbye.
Right.
Finally, since that even was proven to not be enough of a threat, he hired an armed guard to sit outside their door. So, are they locked up? Are they physically locked up in chains and manacles? No, that's not what slavery looks like anymore.
Well, but it's mostly, my understanding from the book, right, is that most of the threat isn't physical in any way. It's an economic threat. It's the threat of, leaving completely aside morale, I'm just like trying to nail down slavery, the idea of slavery here as opposed to, if I don't show up at work, the Atlantic Monthly will fire me, and then I won't have money to make my rent, and I will end up out on the street, and very bad things will happen to my credit rating, and so forth.
But that's not slavery.
No, that's not slavery. That's economic coercion. So, does economic coercion cross the line? At what point? I think I would argue that economic coercion is never slavery. It's, it may be a bad.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's not what I'm writing about in the book. In the case of the book, we're talking about force and threats of force. And I think threat of deportation is different than economic coercion. Threatening to use the legal process to harm somebody is a little bit closer to threat of physical violence than just plain old economic coercion. So I'm with you on economic coercion.
But again, what they're threatening to do, the employer has given them something of value, which is a visa to enter the United States, which is linked to working at this one plant.
Which he has fraudulently obtained.
Right, that's an immigration. That's a question about our immigration law, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a slavery issue. It's an issue of immigration law violation, and whether or not whether we should control the entry of these workers or not. The fact is, whether it's fraudulently had it not been fraudulently obtained, these workers would never have entered the United States in the first place.
Correct.
So, to the extent that it's valuable to them, the fact that the employer committed fraud is not necessarily you can't say, well, they ought to have it, but the employer ought not to have gotten it for them, because they would never have been allowed to enter on normal visas.
Wait, we're getting very complicated here. What if we flip this? Okay, let's say you get an offer for a job in London that would triple your wages, and someone brings you over there, and you get there, and they take your passport, and they house you in some company housing, and they tell you in 6 different ways that you are not free to leave. At that point, and let's say also you borrowed $100,000 or $200,000 for the privilege of getting this job. Once you're there and you're locked in this place, do you want to quibble about whether it's slavery or not, or do you just want to get out of there?
Well, but I often want to get out of places where I'm not.
In all of the situations you're talking about, there's not that fear of, I need to get out of here. That's what I'm talking about. That's what makes it slavery. So whether it's 2 minutes or whether it's 2,000 years, it doesn't matter. You're locked inside someplace and you're thinking, I need to get out of here.
But again,
That's what makes it different
I've
from
been
all
locked
these other
inside
situations.
I've been locked inside of meetings that I wanted to get out of and didn't because if I lost my job, I would very bad economic things would happen to me, which seems to be mostly what this is. I mean, this is an extension of economic necessity, not an extension of physical coercion. Deportation.
Okay, you keep identifying with people who are like us, and really the reason I wrote my book is to help it so that people can identify with people who are not like us. Because that sort of seems what's vital to a functioning democracy. So instead of continually identifying with people who live in the same reality, it would be helpful to start understanding what's life like for other kinds of people. And
okay, so my grandfather, when he started his business, he borrowed money against his father's and his father-in-law's farms in order so they co-signed a loan for him. If he had lost the business, 2 of his family, two family members would have lost their farms. And that wasn't particularly unusual in Western New York at the time, right? So, not only he and my grandmother, but most of his extended family were living out on the street. That's a terrible situation to be in, but it's not slavery. It wouldn't have even been slavery if someone had told him, well, now you have to stay at this gas station 24 hours a day. It's just a terrible economic situation.
I agree completely.
And so I'm not,
so let's say somebody took him while he was in that vulnerable position and said, you're going to work for me and I won't let you go.
But they did leave,
makes it slavery. It's not being vulnerable.
But they also did leave.
It's not being in a desperate situation. Sorry.
They left the premises. What they couldn't do was stop working for this company, which is true of most of these kinds of visas. You can't stop working for the company that brings you in. But they left the premises. They weren't, in fact, they not only weren't locked in, they did in fact go off fairly frequently, which is how the whole thing got started. They met someone in church whose main objection seems to have been that they were being paid less than minimum wage.
Well, and that they were being told that they couldn't or shouldn't leave the premises. I don't know how we're getting into this conversation. Shouldn't be going for 10 minutes. Let's call it something else. Let's call it Vienna sausage instead of slavery. We can call it whatever we want. I'm just saying that it's a bummer, A.
Yeah.
And B, that it's a threat to free people in a democratic society. So
let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay, because in the Tulsa case that I read about, this guy starts laying off Americans who are making $15 to $20 an hour. And that's the real threat here. This is why you don't want to have 10 to 20 million undocumented workers being exploited in your country, because it undercuts regular working people. It undercuts employers who are playing by the rules and paying, according to the laws that we as a democratic society have arrived at. And so anything that undermines that from above or below is of concern to me. Okay. And that's really at the core of what I'm writing about in the book.
So it's less about the Indians and more about us.
Well, ultimately, yeah.
So we shouldn't employ low-wage workers because then American workers won't make as much money, and if the low-wage workers have to be on a farm in India, I mean, like, I guess that was part of my question reading this, right, is that for all of these people, and I just got back from Vietnam and Cambodia, and you go to a garment factory there, and you look at it, and I've had some bad jobs. This is a pretty bad job. It's incredibly boring, and yet you have to focus. It's kind of appalling that people spend their lives doing this, and you walk away thinking this is really a tragedy. But it's not a tragedy that was done to those people. They want those jobs. Those jobs are valuable to them. And so a lot of times in your book, part of my question, right, is who benefits from the labor laws? Who benefits from this? Are we worried about the slaves, or are we just worried about the fact that they undercut much wealthier American workers?
I'm worried about both. There was a nice idea to come up with this whole thing called democracy and make laws that we all have the opportunity to participate in making. I think it's a much better arrangement than feudal systems or theocracies or whatever kinds of situations people used to live in before. And so what concerns me is the rule of law and how to make a democracy function well. So on the one hand, of course I'm concerned about workers being abused or anyone being abused in any way. But I'm also concerned about preserving what works about American society. Yeah. Is that a crazy thing to be concerned about?
No, I don't think it's a crazy thing to be concerned about. I guess I wonder. I mean, there, Brian Kaplan, who's a fairly extreme libertarian, is sort of summed up the libertarian response to a lot of the stuff about immigration and trade, which is, are low wage American workers a master race? Are we justified in doing anything in their name? When you look at the suffering of poor people abroad, the fact that someone goes from $20 to $15 an hour is a small tragedy compared to someone in Cambodia who can't afford to send their kid to school or feed them protein. And Cambodia is another place where the garment industry is hugely taking off and is responsible for what tiny little amount of prosperity that country has. And that's why I ask about the deportation, actually, because what it strikes me in this case and in the Saipan case, not in the first case, is that the workers don't actually want to leave. Right? They would like to go to another company, perhaps, but often not even that. They don't want to go home. They don't want to go back to China. They don't want to go back to India.
Right. Again, this is because we're dealing with people who are not like you and people who are not like me and not like people who we know. These are people, there's a great quote from that labor activist Charles Kernigan who said, there are millions of people around the world who their choice is to go from desperation to poverty.
Right, but that's, but I guess my question...
So yeah, there are people who will willingly sign up for bad jobs that we don't want to have. I mean, I agree with what you said about garment workers. Like, it's a horrible job, but I wrote this book for 6 years, and after I looked at them for long enough, I stopped feeling sorry for them. Because you talk to people and you say, do you want this? Is this your choice? And they say yes. And I have no problem with that. That's great. That's not slavery. That might be a tough life, but that's the way the world is. Some people are going to have tough lives. That's not what I'm writing about. That's not the bright line between slavery and non-slavery. That's not really what I'm concerned with.
I guess
to go back to what we were talking about a second ago about the sanctity of American working class people. Look, we're a country of immigrants and so on and so forth. We let in people before, Irish, Jewish, Italian, whatever, and each of these waves of immigration, the people were legally admitted into the polity. So even if they had a rough time at first, they could eventually organize and use their vote and use their citizenship as a way of protecting themselves. So my big concern is dealing with people who are not given citizenship. I have no problem allowing more immigrants to come into this country if that's what employers of this country need, and we arrive at that decision democratically. That's great. whether it's 10 million a year or 2 million a year or whatever, but they have to be legal citizens to be able to participate in democracy. Otherwise, it erodes the very notion of democracy.
I guess I would say, and this is an argument I have frequently-ish with people who are against immigration, and they say, well, but these people broke the law. And you're, I think, coming at it from the other end, which is that you don't care that they broke the law, but you care that their employers are breaking the law by hiring them. Is that a fair?
No, I care about both. But yeah, my eye is on the fact of here's 90+% of the society who are inside of the polity, and there are people doing illegal activity on the margins of the polity, which erode the strength and self-sustenance of that polity.
But most people on a daily basis break laws that have been democratically enacted, right? Like, I drove down from New York last night, and I didn't go the speed limit, despite the fact that all of my neighbors... You're admitting
that here. This could be broadcast nationally, Megan.
You can't catch me now, coppers. The car's back
there are
in the
traffic
garage.
cops watching this show by the dozens.
Well, I'm not going to tell them how far I went over the speed limit. Maybe it was only a mile. But I didn't drive the speed limit. And that's because I think that, in fact, like, I have better local information, and my neighbors didn't really mean it, and so forth. So, and there are other laws that I actually think that people should just break because they're wrong. Anti-miscegnation laws would be, that we have had certainly democratic laws in our country that even were sustained by the majority, such as, anti-homosexuality laws that are just wrong and that should be broken. And given the desperation of the workers who come here, all of whom, with the exception of people who are held, right, physically held, which is the first case that you talk about, all of whom are in some sense better off than they were before, which is why they don't want to leave, which is why the threat is deportation, not, physical violence. I agree that their employer was clearly a crazy scumbag. Don't get me wrong.
I don't want to keep coming back to this again and again because it's sort of boring to keep coming back to the same point. But I think the point is, again, what I keep coming back to in the book is just what happens when people with more power encounter people with less power in unfair circumstances. Now, obviously in life people have different degrees of power. And whatever, I'm not arguing that that we're ever going to have anything in the world like real equality. But when you are actually fostering situations of extreme inequality, that's when the horns come up and the fangs come out, and we see the kind of stuff John Locke wrote about and the kind of stuff that led to tyrannies, in a dozen different forms in past societies. So what you're sort of writing off as a minor violation on the margins, really, really, really look deeply into it and spend time with it, and you realize, oh, this is the stuff of eventual tyranny. The stuff accrues and changes the structure of society eventually. This is how it happens. So,
is that really so, though? Because, I know the conditions in which my ancestors worked when they got here from Ireland, and they're worse, in fact, than some of the things you talked about. They got here and they lived 10 to
Okay, but what you had in the past in America, you had huge inequality, but wages for working class people were rising, and you weren't having what we've been having since 1974, which is...
that's not entirely accurate economic history. Wages...
It is too. Their wages went up.
Well, eventually.
There wasn't a sustained period where workers' wages went down.
Sure,
there was not any such thing, even though there was miserable inequality.
There were like spans of... you had 5-year recessions in the 19th century where unemployment would rise to double-digit levels and real wages would drop.
Sure, and the Depression, but you never had anything like we've had since 1974, where just about every year since 74, wealthy people have gotten wealthier and poorer people have gotten poorer.
No,
never. You've never had anything so sustained.
But that's also not true. Poorer people aren't poorer. They're richer. Their consumption...
I don't know. Are you saying that the people at the Department of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau are like communists who are fudging their numbers? That's where I get my numbers from.
Well, first of all, you got to look at total compensation and not wages. Second of all, for the poor, most of their income comes from things like the earned income. Not most, but a sufficiently substantial chunk of their income comes from things like the earned income tax credit, which have increased Massively since 1970. Massively since 1970.
So you're saying that this whole increasing gap between rich and poor that keeps getting written about is just a fiction?
It's way more complicated than what you're saying, is what I'm saying. It isn't that wages have... I mean, wages are a small picture of it. I mean, Germany has the same level of pre-tax inequality that the United States records.
Right, but not post-tax. They're not. Have they abolished their estate tax recently?
But
I didn't hear about that.
But all of the numbers you're citing are pre-tax, and once you factor in taxes, it looks different. But also, you have to.
So, to you, we don't really have a problem with widening income inequality in this country?
My problem with inequality, I don't care about inequality. I care about whether people at the bottom are better or worse off. Inequality to me is not a particularly interesting metric. But that aside, like
it
what
would
you
be
described,
if you were on the other side of the food chain.
Why? I don't care if I were suddenly twice as well off, but Bill Gates were suddenly 4 times as well off. Would I care? No.
I mean, the issue isn't really the income; it's the access to political power, right? The idea of democracy is everybody's supposed to have equal access to political power.
But, I mean,
okay,
is it true that people have less access to political power than since 1974?
Yes.
In what way?
The short answer... Okay, here's a good example. I'll just read you some stuff that I got ready. Okay. 9 out of 10 individuals in families with incomes over $75,000 vote. If you look at families with under $15,000 income, half the people vote.
And
now, you could argue,
how far has that dropped since
vote.
1974? How far has that dropped since 1974?
From X to Y. I can't really answer that. 95% of American campaign contributions come from the wealthiest 12% of American households.
Right, but that's changed, like, in your direction for the better since 1974, because that's when we got campaign finance law after Nixon.
According to a couple different studies by some people at Princeton, constituents at the 75th percentile of income distribution have 3 times as much influence on senators' general voting patterns as those at the 25th percentile. And several times more influence than that on specific roll call votes, for example, abolition of the estate tax.
Right, but what you're saying is that it's gotten worse. You're not just saying, like, you're saying that, like, and I, first of all, am not clear that those statistics have gotten worse, and second of all, like, I mean, they're in fixed. There's always going to be a 75th percentile. What I would need to know is that the 75th percentile suddenly has vastly more influence than it used to, and I don't really get the sense that that's true. Certainly not.
Why don't you show me some examples instead of telling me that you don't have the sense that it's true?
Okay, well, in the 19th century, most of the people that you were talking about at the very bottom, right, were immigrants who didn't legally have the right to vote. So they didn't participate in the democratic process at all.
What do you mean? You're saying they weren't legal citizens?
Well,
we never had a problem with such a large percentage of our population being undocumented before.
Well, we actually don't know because we didn't really try to document them. My family, for example, was never documented entering the United States. They just came down over the Canadian border in the 19th century before there were border controls. What we documented was the people arriving. So
you've got illegal immigration, driving over the speed limit. Megan.
Yeah, we're a bunch of lawless communists. I mean, no one tried to stop us. We just came. But that's like we don't have good documentation prior to about 1880 because that's when Ellis. Like we have guesses at how many Irish entered the United States from the famine, but we don't know because no one was trying to count them. No, there was no process for being counted.
Well, let's go back to this thing about inequality, because you're either denying that there is rising inequality in this country, or you're arguing that it's not a bad thing. And I guess I want you to tell me, how is rising inequality a good thing?
I think it's an irrelevant thing. I think what matters to me is what's happening to the poor, what's happening to people in society. Are they getting poorer or richer? Are the poor, are the worse off? I don't care relatively how well they are. Are they getting better off? Are they at the minimum?
Do you know that America's infant mortality rate passed going downwards past Cuba's last year.
Yeah, but
Cuba has less infant mortality than
well,
we do.
Cuba's a communist country that has a vested interest in collecting statistics. And, like, the government runs the Statistics Bureau, so I wouldn't really. But the other thing is that the United States has two things counting against it. One, for reasons that we don't understand at all. African Americans have weirdly high rates of preterm birth. Even when you control for income, education, access to health care, anything you would want to control for, they still have more than twice the rate of preterm birth of white American women, and they have earlier preterm births, and which pushes up our infant mortality. The other thing is that we define smaller preemies than most countries as being babies, and when you control.
So do you think that
when you control for those,
the government's response to New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, you don't think that has anything to do with inequality in this country?
I think it has.
Or was that just an accident?
Well, I think it has to do with a lot of things, right? But I mean, the government of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans. There are a lot of institutional problems in the cities. FEMA is a disaster. I mean, I'd be happy to debate any of those things, but, like, do I think it's because New Orleans was poor? Yes, in the sense that I think that poor places tend to have incredibly dysfunctional governments, and I don't know which the chicken, what the chicken and egg factor is there. But they tend to be incredibly dysfunctional. There were so many failures up and down the chain there, from the decision not to evacuate, from not planning to evacuate people properly and so forth on the city level, all the way up to the federal government. I mean, it was a tragedy that shouldn't have happened, and I'd be happy to discuss, ways in which we could make that not happen again. And yes, I think that absolutely poverty affected people because, for example, the hurricane struck on the 28th day of the month, and if you've ever lived in a high poverty neighborhood, you know what that means. I mean, this means everyone was completely tapped out and had absolutely no money to go anywhere. They had no credit cards to get motel rooms. They didn't have mobility the way wealthier people did. And people didn't think about moving them, and that was absolutely... But I don't think that we abandoned them because they were poor. I think that there were, like, just a series of hugely terrible things interacting, one of which was that they were poor, and another of which was that FEMA was having issues, and the third of which was that their city government didn't work. I mean, all of those things coming together. I don't think it's a straight story of inequality in America abandoning its poor now.
Okay, so rising income inequality in this country has no deleterious effect on democracy. We've got that settled.
Yeah.
That's great.
But
can we talk about the book?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I keep getting... I don't stay on track very long.
So back to why do people do this? What's your sense of I mean, how much?
Why do people enslave other people?
How much access did you have to employers to talk about what they did?
A lot. And the most interesting thing I found was, this wasn't in every case, but in many, many cases, there was this really close link between some kind of paternalistic or sympathetic feeling and assertion of control over someone else's life. There was a great example, of a couple in, like, Indiana or someplace that would go to Costa Rica every year for their vacation. And they got friendly with some local family, and they decided to bring up a 15 or 16-year-old girl from the local family to live with them in Indiana and help out around the house. And they thought, this is great. We'll give her an education. She'll have more to eat. We'll have someone to help her around the house. It's great. Well, after a couple of years, the girl had sort of become Americanized, and she got a boyfriend, and her boyfriend said, gee, that's weird that they have so much control over you and they hardly ever let you out of the house. You're supposed to be able to be free to come and go as you please. And she started making more demands on her quote-unquote family/employer, and they started getting really angry at her, and like, we are doing you a favor, we brought you up. And finally, she filed charges, and I don't know what the couple, whether they're charged with, I think they were charged with slavery, because they weren't paying her. And the couple just kept saying, we treated her like one of the family. And I saw this again and again. The guy in Tulsa that I read about, John Pickle, said over and over again, I feel like I've bent over backwards to try to help these Indian boys, and I feel like I've been stabbed in the back. Now, this is a man who hired an armed guard to watch over his employees after he took away their passport. So, it's very interesting when you look at the minds of people who are doing bad stuff to other people. They so often think that they're helping them. And it makes me think a lot about Thomas Friedman going around interviewing the CEOs of this world and talking about how great globalization is. And to me, a more democratic and sort of earthbound way of reporting that story would be to talk to all participants and get equal input, because that's what democracy is supposed to mean. And so when we talk about how we are helping, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, I want to see them on my TV show talking about how great it is. Because you read someone like Mike Davis, his book Planet of Slums, and the number of people who are getting forced off of their land around the world and forced to join this global economy and forced to live in cities where they don't really have a place to stay and they're making $1 or $2 a day. I'm not sure if they would present the same worldview that Thomas Friedman presents.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Like, how do they? Because I've just been in Cambodia and Vietnam. Unfortunately, we didn't spend enough time talking to the people, the ordinary people. We did talk to some, and how do you see them being forced off their farms by globalization? How is that working?
Well, principally because of American and European farm subsidies. And I know I've seen one of your blogs before. You don't like the farm bill either. I think it's a terrible thing because it does interrupt with a free market working that would be better off uninterfered with. Let's say you're a Chinese peasant farmer or a Mexican peasant farmer or whatever, and you used to get a certain price for your main crop, and that gave you a little bit of free cash to buy some crummy clothes and some crummy supplies, and you got by. Well, now because of these farm subsidies, and because of the reach of these global, agri-food businesses, the prices have gotten so depressed for those. Cotton is another amazing example that really, really distorts the market for African farmers. So these people get chased off their land. They can no longer afford to live on the ancestral land, so they end up in slums. And they go from being pretty much miserable people who lived outside of the economy to being even more miserable people who are now countable, quantifiable members of the global economy. So on the one hand, a statistic that says, oh, well, we've lifted them out of poverty and they went from making $0 to making $2 a day or whatever, isn't really an accurate or meaningful way of measuring that process.
Is that, I guess I would, in part because most of the stuff that's subsidized isn't, I think of the subsidies as preventing people from trading with us who could. I'm not sure that there's actually that, for example, Egyptian farmers, African farmers could sell us a lot of cotton that they're not selling us. So they could sell sugar cane in the Caribbean that they're not selling us. But the American...
Well, why do you think they're not selling it to us? I don't think
it's the American sugar system isn't making them poorer in the sense of making them poorer than they were before. It's making them poorer than they could be. We're not dumping sugar cane.
No, it's artificially depressing. If you're a free marketer, and believe me, I'm not completely against the free market or against capital, blah, blah, blah. I'm not completely anti that stuff. I just think there's a role for government, there's a role for we need to always foster discussion between all members of society if you want to avoid tyranny. That's why the whole democracy thing is kind of groovy.
But in this case, right, the subsidies they're about keeping the price high on the domestic market. They're not about, we don't dump extra commodities. It's not like that stuff has...
No, but it does. If you look at how aid so often works in Africa, it devastates the local farmer's ability to produce in a capitalistic way because it depresses the grain prices so much.
Right, I think that food aid But food aid is a different thing from I wouldn't call that capitalism or globalization. That's just... food aid is really complicated, and what we should do about food aid. If you look at some place like Cambodia where the rice yields are really low because of the collapse of... allegedly, I haven't studied the matter in depth myself. What I'm told is that it's the collapse of sort of traditional land tenure under the Khmer Rouge. And so Cambodia used to be a rice exporter, and now it's pretty much nowhere on it. They're not poor because of any rice subsidy anywhere. The rice subsidies in Japan, for example, keep the domestic price high. It's not that they dump extra production in the world market. But they're just poor because they don't produce that much.
We're getting very far away from my book.
They're just poor because they just can't produce that much. Their agricultural yields are very low.
Well, they have a lot of issues, obviously, going on in Cambodian society.
No, but I mean, this is true in Africa, too.
Besides just subsidies, and so it's a weird
But
comparison.
in Africa, too, like, a lot of the reason that they're poor, right, is that they've got land tenure problems, they've got salinization of the soils, they're not getting the yields they used to because... we're not making them...
Right, but the fact that we give California cotton farmers something like a 90%... I can't remember what the figure is, but like we give them 90% of every dollar that they earn from their crop. It's totally
I agree with you. It's a sin that cries out to heaven for justice, but it's not actually making them poor.
So that definitely depresses the price for African cotton. Let's not, so then they end up being herded into Kinshasa or someplace like that.
But it's going to be a smaller effect than what would happen if we dumped the traditional EU. Like, it used to be that we would actually dump commodities in foreign markets that were subsidized, and we still do to some extent. But now, on the other hand, for many commodities, globalization is doing the reverse, right? You've got people in Latin America and in Asia to some extent and in Africa being pulled out of poverty because Chinese demand is so high that it's actually pushing the global price of food up. And now you've got...
When I see those guys why don't you have them as guests on your blog? And we should just, instead of you and I talking about them, we should let them talk for themselves.
They are...
Do you want me to... I brought a tape that I could play. This whole language thing is really, really key to what we're talking about. This is why I keep returning to this idea of we need to talk to people who don't look like us or talk like us. Because if you can hear what they're saying across this language barrier, half the time what they're saying is, help me! And let me just play this tape, okay? This is what I'm writing about in my book, and this is what I'd like to yank this discussion away from, is this kind of disconnect from what's really going around about you. This is Mexican migrant worker I wrote about in the Florida part of my book, right? These guys are under the domain of this guy named El Diablo, this labor contractor who controls a sizable chunk of rural swampland in Florida, where he controls this workforce of hundreds of workers. And if one of them tries to leave his area, or even if he sees a worker trying to leave his area and he thinks it's one of his workers, he has now been recorded twice attacking the vans who are carrying people away from his area. And in one case, he pistol whipped the driver of one of the vans and split the guy's face open in two. And I saw all this stuff at the trial. Now, when these guys try to call 911 to report, literally, there are men here with guns smashing this van that I'm using to legally go from one place to another in a free country. This is what they get. It's hard to understand.
What's your emergency? Yeah, I need a couple here because they're in a fight with guns. Where at, sir? Where? At Mercadito, the store. I'm not understanding what you're saying. Slow down. Mercadito, the store. Margaret, spell it. Is there any other thing around? Hello. Hello? Yes, where are you at? Somebody here. I am not understanding where you're at. Are you in Sebring, Park?
Okay, so number one, imagine that's you. There's someone beating up your friends or smashing your driver's face in. I mean, we can sit here and argue all day, but the fact is we now live in this global world, and we are connected to people all around the planet economically, which is to also say politically. We are now, whether we want to think of ourselves as Americans who live in this one country, we are now doing business with the whole globe. And that has political implications. And we don't know how to talk to these people, and we don't really know their reality. And I think it's great that you just went to Cambodia, but we need a lot more of that. We need more people like you and I going off to Cambodia and every other country with whom we do business and actually learning how to talk to these people, not just the CEOs, but find out how well is this working. And until we have more mechanisms in place to make that happen, I think any discussion of anything as big as globalization and free market, blah, blah, blah,
well, I guess
is pretty meaningless.
I can look at what
we don't have enough information.
Right? They come here. The illegal immigrants, I can look at what the illegal
immigrants
do.
Wait, say it again, I'm sorry.
Which is that they come here and they keep coming. And they go to Mexico and they come back. Which seems to me to indicate that it's working for them better than whatever the alternative is. And their alternatives are bad. But I guess what I...
It's funny. Dennis Miller. I was on the Dennis Miller show a couple weeks ago. He said the same thing you're saying.
Okay. I guess I feel like the thing is that I'm not clear who this is for. The workers And I'm not in any way defending...
Okay, I'm coming from a perspective where the idea is that people should promote equality and people should promote healthy, sane, legal treatment of other people around them. I am not so impractical that I think the world's ever going to be this utopian place where everybody's equal and everything is great. But I'm saying once you abdicate any concern for doing that, if you lapse into this market fundamentalist thing of just like, oh, daddy will take care of the whole thing, the market will take care of the whole thing. It really is this fundamentalism that's no different from Islamic or Christian fundamentalism, this notion that the market will somehow take care of everything.
I kind of beg to differ on that.
I know you do. I know. Your whole position is staked on this kind of market fundamentalism that it gives people jobs these days. It will make your betters very happy. It will get you hired for jobs much more than writing about poor people. But I hate to tell you, those poor people are still out there.
Son is arguing that we make them in some way worse off. That we're responsible for their poverty in a causal way.
I'm not saying we anything. I'm saying look at the supply chain that brings food into your mouth. Most normal people, and I mean from the CEO level down to garment workers, people agree that slavery is a bad thing. And so what I'm looking at in my book are the conditions that allow slavery to happen. And it's a pretty technical thing. It can be tweaked very easily. There are very, discrete, concrete acts that can be done to improve conditions so that slavery doesn't happen.
Let's talk about, let's talk about what those are. What should we be doing differently?
Well, whether you like illegal immigrants or not, and I actually have very conservative positions about immigration, if you have 10 to 20 million people in your country who speak a different language, you need them to have access to people who speak their language. Otherwise, if they're not citizens and they don't have political means of redress, it creates something corrosive and fairly radically influential on your polity. Okay, so the fact that these guys are getting beaten up and they can't call 911 and have someone speak Spanish is a crime. Okay, there are 300,000 agricultural workers in Florida who speak Spanish. And if they can't call up the Department of Labor or the cops and have someone who understands where they're getting mugged or beaten up or raped or held, that's a problem. If they call the Department of Labor in Fort Myers, they get an answering machine that goes womp, 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 this kind of bureaucrat speak in English. And at the end of the message it says, oh, and by the way, we're open from 8 a.m. to 12:30 on Wednesdays. Okay, so that's basically like the Department of Labor saying, we're not home, gone fishing. So for me, if I were in charge, if I were president, I would think, I bet you we could probably spend $50 million a year on some Spanish-speaking Department of Labor people to go out into the fields and just resume this thing and let employers know, by the way, Big Brother is watching you a little bit, so let's try to rein in the worst of the abuses.
But most of what the Department of Labor would do is get them deported, right? Because they're not working legally.
I think that's a separate issue, and I don't want to get into that. You're asking what would I do to help prevent slavery. I mean, in all of these cases that I write about, by the way, the amount of money being saved by having conditions so bad that they sometimes lapse into slavery is infinitesimal, especially in agriculture. I mean, 1/4 cent of what we all pay at the grocery store is saved by having conditions be that bad. For clothing, who's the scholar? Andrew Ross calculated that it would cost 6% for all of us to, buy all the clothes that we buy and have it not come from horrible sweatshops. Now, maybe that just means they come from slightly less horrible sweatshops, but whatever. People would be paid a living wage. So, for all of these things, it's a matter of enforcement, and who does the enforcing? Well, you seem to have this belief that people would just enforce themselves to be nice people, or what?
Okay, so I have a belief that as long as there is a physical right of exit, right, no one should be physically held against their will.
Mm-hmm.
Nor do I think that people should have to pay to get jobs. I have no idea how to stop it, but I don't think they should. And I think that that's that's one of the corrosive practices in third world countries in general about any job that pays well. But I also want to look at the other side of the ledger, right? So why do people pay to get jobs in America? They pay because the jobs are incredibly valuable. They're paying because this job gives them something that they can't have in India. And I look at those farms there. Like I remember telling my grandfather once, 'cause he grew up on a farm before he bought his business, and that I could picture him being a pioneer. And he just looked at me and he said, "I don't think you have any idea how I feel about indoor plumbing." And I was talking to a guy coming back from Cambodia, and he's Cambodian, which was Cambodian American, and so we were talking, and he was just going on and on and on about how crowded, no indoor plumbing, et cetera, the farms are. And we didn't make the farms be that way. That's the way they've always been.
I'm not arguing that life in Cambodia or Mexico is better than life here, or that
is it better
obviously
than
there are clear advantages.
And the people seem to be answering that question no by going to work there. It's not better. It is, the sweatshop is better than what they're leaving behind.
Right. I mean, is it better to be raped one time or to be raped 100 times? It's a ludicrous question.
Well,
it would be better not to be raped at all.
But wait.
I'm not saying that all of these workers...
Like, they're poor. They are paid very little to do what they do. The people, don't get me wrong, people make profits, but they also, their productivity is lower, so they get paid less for that reason as well. But and one of the interesting things in your book, it's a sidebar, and we probably shouldn't go into it, is the difference between labor productivity in China and Saipan. I found really interesting. But the fact is, like, if I raise the wage in that sweatshop, and I pay them a living wage, some of them won't get those jobs. The government jobs will stay here in the U.S., right? Which is why unions like living wages abroad, and why they always fight for higher labor standards abroad and so forth. To me... Wait,
hold on one second. Why does Cambodia have a garment industry? Why does it not go to China? Because they have actually demonstrated, they have a track record of proving that they can do it with less abuse than China. That's why American manufacturers are happy to do business with them. Isn't that part of it? So we're talking about extra market concerns that do have an influence, and the fact that people are willing to pay a little bit more than market rates.
They have a garment industry because of their labor standards, I agree, but that's because we, in exchange for their labor standards, exempted them from the quotas that we have slapped on other Asian nations after the expiration of the multi-fiber agreement in 2004, which you talked about.
So we're talking about something that has nothing to do with the free market and has something to do with people working out an agreement that is putting welfare above just this sort of rather simplistic market mechanism.
Right, but then you have to look at the workers in Cambodia and Vietnam.
And I think that's marvelous.
Because those jobs went to Cambodia. And Cambodia is so poor that it's hard to get upset about that. But at the same time, like, there are people in Vietnam now who are living on a farm like that with no indoor plumbing. It may not be hooked up to the electric grid, et cetera, because that factory is in Cambodia. And every time you save an American garment worker job, there is someone on a farm in some place in Asia with no electricity and no indoor plumbing, and a thoroughly inadequate supply of protein, who doesn't have a job. And when you raise wages, the evidence is that those jobs then don't go. So yeah, I think there's a cost.
That's I don't want to use the word nonsense because that's not what I'm all about, Megan. But there's room for everybody to have a nice meal at the end of the day, and I'm just kind of focusing on how to make that happen. I don't think that... I mean, I do think it's really interesting that if free trade were a reality, that American wages would go down and foreigners' wages would go up. You know, most Americans would be screaming and angry about that, but if you are someone who believes that people are all equal, that would be
it's not clear
a positive thing.
True,
however...
Right? Like, there's also...
it's not clear that it's actually happening that way. When you have rising inequality happening both in the U.S. and globally, it's clear that that's not just some equilibrium that mechanically works itself out. There are other factors playing around with the game.
There are also a lot of other factors in inequality, things like technology that seem to be playing a larger role. But there's not a good 1-for-1 or even 1-for-8 correspondence between a country's trade and its level of inequality. It's true globally, right? Well,
there is a rather constant factor throughout human history, which is that power tends to accrete, and people who have power tend to use it to try to get more. So if you're looking at rising inequality, you can blame it on all these mechanical things, but it's always a good idea to come back to the human factor and think, I wonder if we are becoming more democratic or less democratic.
I guess I would just question, my dad's a lobbyist. Or was a lobbyist, or the head of a trade association, I should say. He employs lobbyists. and I question. I mean, so I've spent a little bit of time in that world. Not like I'm certainly no expert, but I question how much influence money has on American politics on large issues. It has influence on small issues, right? Like it has influence on obscure provisions of the tax code that you've never heard of, which benefits some company over another company, or benefits some company over the U.S. taxpayer. But on issues like immigration, is our immigration policy really driven by companies? Or is it driven by the broad swath? I mean, you look at what people are saying on immigration now, what just happened to Hillary Clinton on the driver's license issue, right? Who won there?
Wait, hold on one sec, because this is turning into 5 questions instead of 1. You said, do political contributions have a lot to do with determining political decisions? I mean, you and I both agree we hate the Farm Bill, we hate farm subsidies. Most Americans by a huge majority, are very much against that, and yet year after year, these subsidies are given out. Do you think that has something to do with the fact that I give very little in campaign contributions, and so do most average Americans, but the agriculture business gives $50 to $60 million a year in federal contributions? Do you think there's a connection?
Yes,
sure.
But I think the more powerful thing, right, is that you have a very small group of people who care on that issue and will vote against anyone who, for example, discontinues corn subsidies. Right? Are corn subsidies because of ADM? No. They're because there are a lot of corn farmers out there, and they all care. And if you cut their subsidies, all of them will vote against whoever cut their subsidies. No one else in America votes about corn subsidies. And so what you have is a natural...
Does that promote democracy or erode democracy?
Like my Uncle Leon's a dairy farmer and can't say enough for milk price supports. I mean... and he's as democratic as it comes. He's been, he's a small dairy farmer in western New York. Well, actually, his son's now really farming it. He's in his 80s, but it's just a fact. This is a fact of democracy. People vote on issues that they care about, and no one else cares. I mean, there's a rich economic literature on this. It's called public choice theory. That you get these effects all the time, and it's got nothing to do with campaign contributions. And no one has come up with any way to stop that from happening. It's just a truth. That any issue where you have a small group of people... It has... I'm sorry, I don't know how to respond to something when you say it has nothing to do with campaign contributions. Well, my Uncle Leon doesn't make any campaign contributions. Right? Like, no one... I really doubt anyone in his county makes campaign contributions of any sizable amount that, like, would have people running scared about the farm lobby. But, the fact is... His senator, his state senator, his congressman, and Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer are all going to line up on milk price supports because they know that if they don't, no one else is going to vote against them. But no one else is going to vote for them for getting rid of them. But by gosh, Uncle Leon is going to take them to the woodshed.
If consumers all united and made a powerful group and more of a concerted, organized approach to saying we want an end to subsidies, but they weren't making campaign contributions... I think that would be great. Do you think, even if they joined up by the millions, that they would be heard in the same way that money is heard?
Better than money is heard, but they don't vote. No one is ever going to vote on farm subsidies. Why do we not get cafe standards? Because the UAW will vote against anyone who votes them in because light trucks are incredibly profitable and they do well for union workers. I mean, yes, GM contributes, but I mean, if you ask a politician what's more important, the fact that he will be voted out of office, or the fact that GM gave him $100,000 to make a campaign commercial, he's gonna go with. And on big issues that voters really care about, they can't cross the voters. That's what Hillary Clinton learned on driver's licenses. You cannot cross people where they feel strongly. You get things that people are all say they're against. But anyway, this is going fairly far afield from. But that's my basic thing about democracies. I think it's considerably more complicated than saying like the person who makes the campaign contributions gets these gigantic payoffs. I don't think they do. I think they get small payoffs in a lot of ways, but not on the scale that you're talking about. If people care about it, the politicians will respect it.
Well, I guess, the thing that I keep coming back to is this great quote from Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court guy from the 1920s, which was the last time that we had wealth inequality. that's at the same levels we have now in the U.S. And he said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. But we can't have both. Now, I think you and I disagree about that. That's fine. I don't think we need to keep arguing about it. I just see a trend away from things that I would consider democratic, and it's troubling to me. It's not troubling to you, so I guess you're going to have a nicer day than I am.
As democratic issues, I guess what I see is a vast sea of incredibly poor people. And so the question for me is less like, if I thought that American democracy were at risk from this, I would worry about it, but I actually just find it hard to believe that. American democracy seems to be.
You don't think the election in 2000 was kind of sketchy? If I saw that in a third world country, I would certainly think, that's typical stuff. It's certainly not a level of finesse or procedural delicacy that I would have thought capable in this country.
I think that American federalism has many issues, but I don't think that income inequality was a major factor playing into the 2000 election. I think there were a lot of problems there with the way that the governments handled it, and I don't know how to fix that because the fact is, like, we're mandated to allow them. But we've had problems since, and it's the same thing. It's not got to do with poverty. It's just got to do with sort of completely incompetent local election officials.
Let's go back and say one last sexy thing about my book.
But wait, I have to finish my sum up,
the sexiest part for you.
Sexy thing about your book. I just see a huge number of poor people, and I don't think American democracy is under threat from them, and therefore my question is, what's the most likely thing to make this huge number of poor people better off? And my answer is setting up factories in their countries, allowing as many as possible of them to come here, and in general allowing free exchange that makes both parties better off to happen, and not trying to second guess it in ways that tends to produce nasty unintended consequences. And I would say that farm subsidies are an example of something that where we're second guessing the market and it produces nasty unintended consequences. But to go back to sexy things about your book, which I will wave at the camera again.
Wait, hold on, wait. Let me just say one last thing about that. I think if you go back to a more Marxist look at things and you analyze everything into capital versus labor, you can talk about free market capitalism until you're blue in the face, but the fact is capital, I'm the 800,000th person to point this out, this is not an original point, but capital can leap around wherever it can get the best deal at the push of a computer button, and labor, unfortunately, is stuck in the form of tawdry human beings like us, and it takes us a while to get on a plane or walk across the Sonora Desert into Arizona or whatever to follow the jobs and follow the money. So you're never going to have anything like a free exchange there. So all of these things that you're talking about, I'm sort of with you in spirit, but I don't think it works that well in reality. How does that get addressed? How does that get adjusted?
One of the
How does that get to be made more fair?
One of the reasons it can't move around is that they station men at the borders with guns to keep them from doing so.
But even if we opened all borders worldwide, which may or may not be a good thing, you'd still have human beings moving more slowly than money.
I'm not
and so, the idea that there's this magic ability for the market to allocate everything most efficiently is that's not enough of a thought.
Well, I guess my question then would be, why do any plants ever open in California to do anything? You just see, I think you see this in terms of people just being made worse off by trade. And I think, some garment worker is now making garments that some guy in North Carolina used to make. Which means that...
No. I don't see trade as being a bad thing. I think it can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on how it's deployed. I'm really concerned with democracy. If you only have some people making these decisions, you're not going to get as effective decisions as if you have everybody involved in a democratic way.
I'm not sure
deciding what's the most fair way to do
things. People
of
these countries have mostly democratically chosen to have lower labor standards, and then we're saying, no, that's not enough. We want to
Do you call China
like
a democracy?
Saipan, for example.
I mean, this is exactly the kind of rhetorical logjam that we come across. We used to buy our stuff from Americans who were protected by laws, who could vote, who could form unions, who could read from a pretty free media, and now we buy all of our stuff from people who live in a country where they can't vote, they only have one party to vote for, they don't have a free media, they can't even change their town from one town to another without paying a lot of bribes.
Latin America.
And we call that free trade. We're now trading with a semi-captive labor force, and we call that free trade. That's a rhetorical problem for me, because I don't smell the freedom.
Malaysia,
Latin America is a great example where the free market has been a colossal failure.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go back and say something sexy about the book, because I think we have to get out of here.
Book? Sexy.
What was the sexiest, funniest part for you?
There's a lot of sex in Saipan.
It may have been none of them.
That was the oddest part for me, is this incredible... I've been in a slightly reversed situation, which is that I went to grad school with... where there were 4 men for every woman. My English is degrading the longer I talk about sweatshops. Well, it's
was
interesting,
that good or
right?
bad?
You get this strange power relationship where the women suddenly get to date out of their weight class because there just aren't that many of them. And you describe a more extreme and less amusing. I mean, of course, the difference is the men in my graduate school weren't actually on an island and could leave and go date elsewhere if they were really desperate.
If you had any say over that, I think you probably would.
I would have let them leave the island. I'm all in favor of.
You could be a very benevolent dictator then.
Libertarians, benevolent dictatorship, about a 180. But if someone let me leave the world, everyone would be allowed to leave their island. Run the world, everyone would be allowed to leave their island whenever they wanted. But yeah, I mean, you described this absolutely. It's really like some. I actually don't know this firsthand, but from what I gather, sort of 14-year-old boys fantasize about is the life that certainly American men get to lead in Saipan. Is that about correct? It's sort of 5 girlfriends and a nonstop round of.
Yeah, that's exactly what I described. I think it's sort of changing. Because a lot of the guest worker population is leaving.
Actually, we should point out that's because of the same thing, that Saipan was a beneficiary of the multi-fiber agreement, and when those quotas were relaxed, most of the factories no longer found it economical to manufacture labor at $3.05 an hour. So actually, I wonder if I could close.
Yes. So it wasn't ever. Hold on, we're getting the sign we got. Yeah. I just. Cut and
okay. Well, anyway, I wonder if I could close with a very quick question, which is since that's happened in the last 3 years. I don't know when the last time you went back to Saipan was.
I was there until
last
September. Is
Saipan a better or a worse place? And are with the factories leaving?
I don't know. It's in so much transition that it would be a very hard thing to measure, and it's also a very general thing to measure, whether it's a better or worse place.
Are the workers
for the local people who live there, it's a very threatening time for them because they're sort of losing their guest worker population who does all the work. So it's totally threatening to them because now they're going to have to get jobs as house painters and waiters and do all of this stuff that sounds terribly threatening until you start doing it. So they feel very humiliated and very upset, and the economy is going down. It's very scary. As a long-term restructuring of their economy, so it's more sustainable and probably something that would make them happier,
and what about the workers
I think it's a great thing.
Are they mostly going off to get better jobs somewhere else?
Again, this is sort of like your approach to Mexicans coming here or poor foreign workers coming here. I mean, I'm worried about the citizens of Saipan more than the guest workers who come there for a short time. I would imagine if they have skills and money and some money saved up, they can go back home to China and the Philippines and do quite well for themselves.
Yes.
Now, Sam, our technician here, is really looking like he's about to stab me in the throat.
Let's close it off. Thank you so much for talking, and I really enjoyed the book. So I highly recommend it to everyone in the audience.
Well, thank you. Thanks for talking to me. Thanks for talking to me with jet lag.
Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, you too. Take care.